What if I told you that America won the war for independence and still almost fell apart? The British Empire, the most powerful military on earth, had been defeated. Victory should have felt glorious, right? But in reality, the new nation was on the edge of chaos. Soldiers were unpaid, farmers were losing their land, and states were fighting each other like strangers. The very freedom they had fought for threatened to destroy them from within. The war was finally over. After 8 long, brutal years, the guns had fallen silent, the British ships had sailed away, and the word independence echoed across the land. On paper, America had won. The most powerful empire in the world had been defeated by ordinary people who refused to bow. It should have been a sunrise after a long, dark night. But for many Americans, the morning after independence felt cold, uncertain, and strangely empty. There were no victory parades waiting for most soldiers, no rewards, no safety net. Men who had survived freezing winters, starvation, and enemy fire returned home only to find their farms ruined, their families struggling, and their pockets empty. Some had been promised pay that never came. Others were handed paper money so worthless it couldn't buy a loaf of bread. These men didn't feel like heroes. They felt forgotten. Across the new nation, the economy was in shambles. Trade with Britain had collapsed overnight, and America had no strong trading partners to replace it. Ports that once buzzed with ships now sat quiet. Merchants went bankrupt. Farmers, already buried in debt from years of war, watched courts seize their land when they couldn't pay taxes. Independence had arrived, but prosperity had not followed. The dream of unity also faded fast. The colonies had fought together, but peace revealed how different they truly were. Each state looked inward, guarding its own interests like a jealous rival. They printed their own money, set their own trade rules, and argued over borders like hostile neighbors. There was no strong central authority to step in, no referee to calm the chaos. America was independent. Yes, but it wasn't united. The government that existed at the time was intentionally weak. The leaders who designed it feared power more than disorder. They had just escaped a king, after all, and the last thing they wanted was another tyrant. So they created a system where Congress could ask states for money but couldn't demand it, where laws could be suggested but not enforced, and where the national government had no army to protect itself. It was freedom by design, but it came at a cost. Foreign nations were watching closely. Britain hadn't completely given up on the idea that America might fail on its own. Spain eyed Western territories. France, America's former ally, wanted its war loans repaid. But the new nation couldn't even agree on how to pay its own soldiers, let alone its international debts. To the rest of the world, the American experiment looked fragile, temporary, even foolish. And then there was the fear no one wanted to say out loud. What if the revolution had been a mistake? What if breaking away from Britain had solved one problem only to create many more? Ordinary people whispered these questions in taverns and town squares. Leaders worried about them in private letters. The victory that had once felt glorious now seemed dangerously uncertain. George Washington watched all of this with growing concern. He had walked away from power when the war ended, believing the nation would find its footing. Instead, he saw disorder spreading like cracks in a poorly built foundation. He warned that the country was drifting toward anarchy and confusion, words that carried real weight coming from the man who had held the army together through sheer will. The irony was painful. America had proven it could stand up to an empire, yet it struggled to govern itself. The passion that fueled the revolution didn't easily translate into patience, compromise, or long-term planning. Freedom had been won on the battlefield, but no one had figured out how to make it work in everyday life. This was the moment history books often rush past. The uncomfortable years between victory and stability. The time when the United States came closer to collapse than most people realize. The danger wasn't invasion or rebellion from abroad. It was slow, quiet failure from within. Independence did not guarantee survival. In fact, it may have made survival harder. The nation stood at a crossroads, unsure whether it was witnessing the birth of something lasting or the beginning of the end. And as frustration grew and patience ran thin, one thing became painfully clear. Winning a revolution was one thing, but building a country was something else entirely. This was America's most dangerous moment. And it was only just beginning. The peace after the revolution didn't last long. What had felt like freedom soon turned into tension, frustration, and fear. Farmers across Massachusetts were drowning in debt, their lands at risk of being taken by the courts. They had fought for liberty, but now their lives felt more controlled than ever. Promises made during the war had gone unfulfilled, and anger simmered quietly beneath the surface. Daniel Shays was one of them. A former soldier, he had fought through frostbite, hunger, and gunfire, believing in the promise of a better future. But returning home, he found himself buried in taxes and fines he couldn't pay. Courts were seizing farms left and right, and local governments seemed deaf to the suffering of ordinary citizens. Shays didn't just feel frustration, he felt betrayal. The freedom he had risked his life for seemed like a cruel joke. The rebellion began quietly, almost like a whisper of revolt. Farmers gathered secretly in barns and taverns, talking about the injustices they faced. They organized, trained, and armed themselves, determined not to be crushed. These weren't reckless criminals, they were men pushed to the edge, people who had given everything to win a nation and now were denied the very independence they had fought for. Tensions rose as the courts continued to seize farms. Shays and his followers marched from town to town, protesting violently but with purpose. They blocked courthouses, refusing to let officials carry out foreclosures. Messages of fear and uncertainty spread quickly. America, the land that had just overthrown an empire, was now on the brink of internal collapse. People whispered in disbelief, "Have we traded one tyrant for another?" The government at the time was powerless to respond. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress couldn't raise an army to stop them. They could ask, but they could not command, and most states were too concerned with their own survival to act. Local militias struggled to contain the rebellion, and the fear of widespread chaos grew. Ordinary citizens wondered whether the new nation could survive its own citizens' anger. Meanwhile, newspapers and letters carried stories of the rebellion far and wide. Some saw the rebels as heroes standing up for their rights. Others saw them as dangerous radicals threatening the fragile experiment of self-rule. The divide among Americans became clear. Independence had united them against Britain, but it had not healed the fractures at home. The new nation was fragile, and each day that passed without a solution made its collapse feel more real. Daniel Shays' actions brought a shocking realization to the leaders of the nation. Independence was meaningless without a strong government to maintain order. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton all watched from afar, worried that the rebellion might inspire similar uprisings elsewhere. If farmers in Massachusetts could take up arms against their own state, what would stop others across the colonies from doing the same? Fear of chaos was no longer theoretical, it had arrived at their doorsteps. The rebellion climaxed in a dramatic confrontation. Shays and his men attempted to seize a federal armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. They hoped to arm themselves for larger resistance, but state militias confronted them. Shots were fired, and for a moment, it seemed as though the young nation might descend into civil war. Although Shays' forces were ultimately defeated, the message was clear. America's victory over Britain meant nothing if its own citizens felt oppressed and unheard. The shock of Shays' rebellion rippled across the country. It forced leaders to confront uncomfortable truths. The Articles of Confederation were insufficient. The experiment in democracy was in danger of failing before it had even begun. Citizens and leaders alike were left asking hard questions. Can a nation survive if freedom itself leads to disorder? How do we protect liberty without destroying it? And in this chaos, a seed was planted. The realization that something had to change, that the rules had to be rewritten, became undeniable. The young United States had survived the British Empire, but it might not survive its own weaknesses. This moment of fear, anger, and desperation would ultimately lead to a new vision, a new framework that could turn rebellion and chaos into a lasting nation. Shays' rebellion was not just a farmer's revolt. It was a warning, a wake-up call, and a turning point. It forced Americans to confront the hard truth. Winning freedom is one thing, but keeping it requires courage, compromise, and bold leadership. And for the first time, it was clear that the next battle would not be fought with muskets against an empire, but with ideas, debates, and the risk of rewriting the very rules of the new nation. The chaos of Shays' rebellion shook the new nation to its core. For 8 years, Americans had fought side by side to defeat the British Empire, and now they were staring at the possibility of losing everything they had fought for, not to a foreign power, but to themselves. Farmers, soldiers, and citizens were rebelling. States were arguing over trade, money, and borders. The fragile union of 13 independent colonies was beginning to splinter. Ordinary people whispered in taverns and town squares, while leaders in Philadelphia and New York wondered if the American experiment might fail before it had even begun. George Washington felt it deeply. He had returned to Mount Vernon, hoping for a quiet life, yet news of armed farmers marching on courthouses reached him like a warning shot across the fledgling nation. Washington had seen what disorder could do during the war, and he knew that without a strong, unified government, the very liberty for which he had risked his life might crumble into anarchy. Even the soldiers who had trusted him through frostbite and enemy fire were now unsure if the country they had fought for could survive. Washington's silence at first was deliberate. He had stepped away from power once before to prove that America could thrive without kings, but he couldn't ignore the mounting chaos forever. Leaders from across the states began to realize that a solution was urgent. The Articles of Confederation, designed to protect freedom by limiting central power, had a fatal flaw. They created a government that could not act decisively. Congress could ask for money, but states could refuse. Laws could be suggested, but not enforced. The young nation had won its independence, but now it faced a greater challenge: how to survive without descending into civil war. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia. Rhode Island refused to send representatives, mistrustful of any stronger federal government, but the others understood that ignoring the crisis was no longer an option. The mood in the room was tense, almost electric. These men were not just politicians, they were revolutionaries, thinkers, and in some cases, stubborn idealists who had risked everything against the British Empire. Now, they were facing an equally daunting challenge. Could they design a government capable of holding a nation together while still protecting freedom? The doors to the Pennsylvania State House were closed, and the windows were intentionally shuttered. What happened inside was meant to be secret. The debates were intense, sometimes heated, as delegates argued over representation, taxation, and the balance of power. Big states wanted influence proportional to their populations. Small states feared domination. Every word, every compromise, carried the weight of history. If they failed, the rebellion in Massachusetts could be repeated across the country, and the Union might never survive. At the center of it all were figures like James Madison, whose quiet intellect shaped much of the discussion, and Alexander Hamilton, whose fiery rhetoric demanded a government strong enough to enforce order. George Washington, though more reserved, gave the proceedings legitimacy. His presence reminded everyone what was at stake: the difference between a nation that endured and one that fractured into chaos. They wrestled with questions no one had answers to yet. How much power should the national government have? How could liberty be preserved while avoiding tyranny? Could 13 fiercely independent states truly function as one nation? Weeks turned into months. Arguments stretched late into the night. Some men walked the streets of Philadelphia to clear their minds, while others pored over maps, drafts, and notes. Every compromise was a tightrope walk. If they leaned too far toward a strong government, the people might see it as a new monarchy. If they weakened it too much, disorder could return. Each debate carried the weight of the revolution itself, the memory of muskets, frostbitten soldiers, and the lives lost for the promise of freedom. Finally, a document emerged. It was imperfect, yet it represented a vision stronger than chaos: a constitution. It divided power into 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, to prevent any one person from gaining too much control. It balanced the interests of large and small states, and it promised, eventually, protections for individual rights. The men who signed it knew the work was only beginning. Ratification by the states would be another battle. But for the first time since the revolution ended, There was hope that the nation might survive its own citizens' passions and mistakes. The Constitutional Convention was more than a meeting. It was the moment when the dream of America was reshaped into something tangible. From the ashes of rebellion, fear, and uncertainty, a framework emerged that could turn chaos into order. The country that had almost collapsed was now preparing to endure. And while questions and divisions remained, one truth was clear: the survival of the United States would depend not on muskets, but on ideas, compromise, and courage. The Constitution was drafted, but the hard part had only begun. Creating a document was one thing. Getting 13 fiercely independent states to accept it was another. Some celebrated, seeing it as the lifeline the nation desperately needed. Others feared it, believing that a strong central government could become just another tyrant, like the king they had fought to overthrow. The debates that followed were not about pen and paper, they were about trust, survival, and the very soul of the new nation. Newspapers buzzed with fiery editorials. Pamphlets flew off presses, letters were exchanged in private, and taverns became battlegrounds of ideas. Federalists led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay argued that the Constitution was necessary to maintain order. Without it, they warned, the nation would collapse under the weight of its own chaos, leaving it vulnerable to internal rebellion and foreign powers. On the other side, anti-federalists, like Patrick Henry and George Mason, warned of the dangers of giving too much power to distant leaders. They remembered the king and feared a new form of tyranny disguised as a government. Arguments were everywhere, and they were intense. Federalists emphasized the need for a strong central authority to collect taxes, regulate trade, and maintain an army. Anti-federalists countered with stories of overreach, predicting that ordinary citizens would be silenced while politicians and elites held all the power. They demanded guarantees for individual rights, arguing that liberty could be lost without them. Every conversation carried the weight of the revolution itself. Freedom had been won, but could it survive the very framework of the government meant to protect it? People weren't just debating abstract ideas, they were terrified. Ordinary farmers wondered if the promises of independence applied to them or only to wealthy landowners. Merchants and soldiers questioned whether their sacrifices had been for a nation that would protect their lives and livelihoods. Town squares and state capitals were filled with public rallies, petitions, and letters read aloud, each one testing the patience of the other. It felt as though the young nation could tear itself apart before it had a chance to stand. In New York and Virginia, the arguments reached fever pitch. Alexander Hamilton wrote tirelessly in support of the Constitution, crafting the essays that would become known as the Federalist Papers. James Madison, calm and meticulous, responded to anti-federalist concerns with logic and reason, explaining how checks and balances would prevent abuse. Meanwhile, Patrick Henry gave speeches that made citizens sweat with fear, warning that a government unchecked would trample freedoms faster than a British redcoat could. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Ratification was a choice between survival and collapse. Weeks turned into months as states voted one by one. Some approved the Constitution quickly, eager to end the chaos. Others hesitated, insisting on amendments to guarantee basic freedoms. Tension filled every corner of the country. Newspapers reported heated arguments, public protests, and even threats of rebellion from those unwilling to accept the outcome. The nation teetered on the edge, uncertain if the experiment would succeed or fail before it truly began. Finally, a compromise emerged that would save the fragile union. The promise of a Bill of Rights, 10 amendments protecting freedoms like speech, religion, and due process won over the skeptics. Anti-federalists agreed to ratification, reassured that citizens' liberties would be protected. Federalists secured the stronger national framework they believed essential. It was a delicate balance, born from fear, compromise, and the hard lessons of the past years. By 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified, and the Constitution became fully operational. The nation had survived what could have been its final test. Independence was no longer just a word on a document, it was a living, breathing government capable of evolving and correcting its own weaknesses. The rebellion that had once threatened to tear it apart became the very force that convinced leaders to create a stronger, fairer system. The story of ratification is often skipped in textbooks, But it is where the survival of America was truly decided. The struggle wasn't against Britain or foreign armies, it was within, fought with ideas, words, and the courage to compromise. Without these debates, the dream of the United States might have ended before it had a chance to grow. And though the Constitution was not perfect, it gave the country a fighting chance, proving that liberty is not given, it is built, maintained, and defended with vigilance and wisdom. As the dust settled, the people of the United States learned a crucial lesson. Winning freedom is only the first step. Keeping it, preserving it, and turning it into a functioning nation is the true challenge. And in that lesson lies the story that continues to shape America, generation after generation. The ink on the Constitution had barely dried, yet the young United States faced its first real test. Could it survive under its own new government? There was excitement. Yes, but there was also fear. Citizens who had fought for independence watched cautiously, wondering if the leaders they had trusted to deliver freedom could now manage peace, prosperity, and unity. The stakes were high, and history was watching. Then came George Washington, the man who had led the Continental Army through frost, famine, and the chaos of revolution. Now faced a different battlefield, the challenges of governing a fragile, divided nation. Unlike the army, where authority was clear and obedience a matter of survival, this new role required diplomacy, patience, and the art of compromise. Washington had to lead not by force, but by example, trust, and integrity, a far more subtle and delicate task than anything he had faced on the battlefield. One of his first challenges was winning the confidence of a skeptical public. Many feared that a strong executive might turn into a king, repeating the oppression they had just fought to escape. Washington understood the danger. He moved cautiously, stepping into the presidency without arrogance, reminding Americans that he would not abuse power. His voluntary relinquishment of power after the war gave him credibility, but even he knew that trust could be lost in a single misstep. Every decision he made was under scrutiny, every action measured against the ideals of the revolution. The young government had to face economic turmoil almost immediately. The country was buried in debt from the Revolutionary War, both to foreign nations and its own citizens. Farmers in western regions protested taxes that seemed unfair, while merchants worried about trade regulations and tariffs. Without a central bank or a coherent financial system, the nation teetered on the edge of collapse. Washington relied on Alexander Hamilton, his Treasury Secretary, to craft policies that could stabilize the economy, but even Hamilton's brilliant plans stirred anger and suspicion among the public. Regional tensions ran high. The North and South had different economies, priorities, and visions for the future. Northern states leaned toward commerce and industry. Southern states relied on agriculture and trade. Washington had to balance these competing interests without alienating either side. One wrong move could have reignited rebellion. One unpopular policy could have torn the Union apart before it had a chance to take root. The nation's survival depended on careful navigation, foresight, and the ability to listen as much as lead. And then came the Whiskey Rebellion, a reminder that governance could still be dangerous. Farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay a federal tax on whiskey, seeing it as another form of oppression. They marched, angry and armed, testing the authority of the new government. Washington faced a difficult choice: ignore the rebellion and risk anarchy, or respond with force and risk alienating the very citizens whose freedom he had fought to secure. He chose to lead federal troops himself, though he did not confront the farmers violently, and the rebellion ended peacefully. The message was clear: the Constitution had teeth, but justice could be tempered with reason. Foreign policy added another layer of complexity. Britain still occupied forts in the Northwest Territory, Spain controlled New Orleans, and France watched the United States warily after its own revolution erupted. Washington's decisions in foreign affairs required a delicate balance of diplomacy, caution, and resolve. One wrong step could have pulled America into another war it was unprepared for. Yet, through careful negotiation, he managed to preserve peace while asserting the nation's sovereignty, a feat few believed possible for a country so young and fragile. Through all of this, Washington remained a symbol of unity. His leadership was measured, honest, and deliberate. He refused to abuse power, respected the Constitution, and consistently placed the nation above personal ambition. Citizens began to see that independence was not only about defeating an empire, it was about creating a government that could endure and protect their liberties. His presidency showed that courage in peace could be just as heroic as courage on the battlefield. By the end of his first term, the United States was no longer a fragile collection of states. It had a functioning government, a stabilizing economy, and a leader who inspired trust. But the work was far from over. Washington understood that independence alone had never been enough. It was the rule of law, compromise, and steady leadership that would truly secure the nation's future. And though challenges remained, the young country had survived its most dangerous moments and begun to turn chaos into opportunity. Even with Washington at the helm, the young United States faced storms that no one could ignore. Independence had been won, but survival was still uncertain. The country had to navigate a world dominated by empires, while balancing the fears, ambitions, and grudges of its own people. The lessons of rebellion were still fresh, and each misstep could plunge the nation back into chaos. Across the Atlantic, Britain was not yet done with its former colonies. Though the war had ended, British troops still occupied forts in the Northwest Territory, controlling trade routes and stirring tension with Native American tribes. American settlers pushing westward found themselves in dangerous disputes, unsure whether they were defending their homes or walking into conflict. France, once a close ally, was now embroiled in its own bloody revolution and couldn't offer the support it once had. Spain controlled the Mississippi River and New Orleans, threatening vital trade. The United States, small and fragile, was surrounded by uncertainty. Meanwhile, domestic pressures continued to simmer. Farmers still struggled under taxes, merchants worried about tariffs, and the scars of rebellion remained fresh. Every new law or regulation was scrutinized with suspicion. People asked themselves, had independence changed anything, or had it simply shifted the weight of authority from one set of rulers to another? When the federal government tried to assert control, some regions resisted, testing the limits of unity. The threat was not foreign this time. It came from within, from citizens unsure whether a central authority could be trusted. The young government also faced the challenge of expansion. Settlers were moving westward, eager for land and opportunity. But this expansion came at a cost. Native American nations who had defended their lands for centuries resisted the intrusion, leading to skirmishes and full-scale conflicts. Negotiating peace treaties often felt like walking a tightrope. Promise too little, and war would erupt. Promise too much, and states would rebel against federal authority. Each settlement carried both hope and tension as the country grew larger, but the threads holding it together remained delicate. Washington and his cabinet realized that the nation's survival depended on careful balance. The military was still small, finances were tight, and citizens' trust was fragile. Diplomacy became a lifeline. Washington negotiated treaties with Britain and Spain to secure borders and trade, while avoiding war that the young country could not afford. He warned against alliances that could entangle America in European conflicts, famously urging neutrality to protect the nation's fragile stability. His decisions were not glamorous. They lacked the thrill of the battlefield, but they were critical to preserving independence. Even with these efforts, divisions grew. Federalists pushed for stronger central control to manage foreign threats and internal unrest. Anti-Federalists worried that too much power would recreate the tyranny they had fought to escape. Newspapers and pamphlets became the battlefield for ideas. Citizens debated loudly in towns, taverns, and marketplaces, their voices carrying both hope and fear. Every dispute over trade, taxes, or Western expansion could ignite tensions that threatened the fragile Union. The Whiskey Rebellion had been an early warning. Now, the nation had to prove that rebellion could be managed without collapsing. When Western farmers protested again, the federal government acted decisively, but with restraint. Washington personally oversaw the mobilization of troops, demonstrating that the government had authority but was committed to justice. The message was clear. Independence had been earned, and the Constitution had teeth, but liberty and order had to coexist. Amid these challenges, the idea of a shared national identity began to emerge. Citizens slowly began to see themselves as Americans rather than just Virginians, New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians. Symbols, stories, and shared struggles helped create a fragile but growing sense of unity. Yet the path was still uncertain. Every victory in diplomacy, every avoided rebellion, was a reminder that the country's survival depended on leadership, compromise, and vigilance. By the end of Washington's presidency, the United States had survived threats from abroad, rebellion from within, and the pressures of expansion. The nation was still young, still fragile, but it had proven that it could endure not just by fighting wars, but by thinking strategically, balancing interests, and learning from its mistakes. Independence had been won on the battlefield, but nationhood was now being won through courage, wisdom, and compromise. America had learned that survival was not guaranteed. It was earned, day by day, decision by decision. And though challenges would continue, the early lessons of diplomacy, leadership, and internal balance would shape the country for generations. The young United States had passed its first real test. The fight was no longer just for freedom, it was for survival, unity, and the promise of a future worth defending. The United States had survived its earliest crises, but the young nation was far from stable. Independence had been won, the Constitution ratified, and Washington's presidency had set a precedent, but the country now faced new challenges that tested its unity, its values, and its very identity. Expansion, growth, and political ambition were on the rise, but so were tensions and divisions. For a nation still finding its footing, every decision felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. Westward expansion was both a promise and a problem. Settlers pushed into new territories, chasing land, opportunity, and freedom. The frontier was a place of hope for some, but danger for others. Native American nations resisted the intrusion, determined to defend their ancestral lands. Skirmishes and conflicts flared along rivers, forests, and plains, reminding the nation that independence brought both opportunity and responsibility. Every new settlement carried the weight of compromise and the risk of bloodshed. Meanwhile, the political landscape of the United States began to shift dramatically. The first political parties were forming, dividing the country along ideological lines. Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, believed in a strong central government, robust commerce, and close ties with Britain. Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, championed states' rights, agrarian values, and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Citizens were forced to pick sides, often passionately, as debates over the nation's direction spilled into newspapers, town meetings, and public squares. These arguments were heated, personal, and sometimes bitter, a far cry from the unity that had carried the country through the Revolution. Economic struggles persisted as well. The country had survived debt and rebellion, but commerce and trade were still fragile. Farmers in the South worried about tariffs and access to markets. Merchants in the North wanted stronger trade agreements. The Mississippi River, controlled by Spain, remained a critical lifeline for trade, and negotiations to secure navigation rights were fraught with tension. Each economic decision was more than policy, it was a question of survival, prosperity, and fairness. Citizens felt the stakes personally, and the government knew every misstep could lead to unrest. At the same time, the young nation was learning the art of governance. Congress debated laws that affected every corner of the country, and presidents had to balance leadership with diplomacy, not just internationally but domestically. Washington's example of restraint and Jefferson's calls for simplicity in government shaped how citizens perceived leadership. Yet even the most cautious presidents had to make unpopular decisions, sometimes angering powerful factions or regional groups. The tension between liberty and order remained as real as ever. Foreign threats never fully disappeared. Britain maintained a presence in North America, guarding forts and influencing Native American alliances. France's revolution created waves of instability, sometimes drawing the United States into the orbit of European conflict. And Spain controlled strategic trade points, forcing American leaders to negotiate constantly to protect commerce. Even as Americans celebrated their independence, the reality was clear: The world outside the new nation's borders was still dangerous, and survival required vigilance and strategy. Despite these pressures, Americans were also building something remarkable. Towns and cities grew, trade networks expanded, and culture began to flourish. Newspapers, books, and pamphlets spread ideas, debates, and knowledge faster than ever before. Citizens began to identify as Americans rather than just Virginians, Pennsylvanians, or New Yorkers. Shared symbols, common struggles, and collective pride helped create a fragile national identity. And while disagreements persisted, a sense of purpose slowly began to bind the states together. Yet the path forward remained uncertain. Expansion brought opportunity but also conflict. Political parties offered governance but also division. Economic growth promised wealth but required tough decisions. Every frontier settlement, every law, every diplomatic negotiation was a test of the young nation's endurance. America had survived the revolution, the chaos of rebellion, and the challenges of establishing a constitution, but it was clear that survival was not guaranteed. It had to be earned, day by day, choice by choice. By the end of this era, the United States had begun to grow in size, influence, and confidence. But the lessons of the past rebellion, chaos, weak government, and fragile unity were never far away. The country had learned that independence alone was not enough. Liberty required careful stewardship, bold leadership, and a commitment to compromise. And as Americans moved west, debated fiercely in politics, and navigated a dangerous international landscape, one truth remained. Freedom is not simply won. It is built, protected, and fought for again and again. The story of the young United States was far from over. Expansion and growth had brought new promise, but they also set the stage for deeper conflicts and tests of unity. And as citizens and leaders looked to the future, one question lingered in every town, every courtroom, and every frontier settlement. Could a nation born in rebellion survive the trials of peace? By the early 1800s, the United States had survived its most perilous years. The revolution was behind them, the Constitution secured, and the new government had proven it could function under pressure. Yet the challenges of building a nation were far from over. The young country had learned that independence was only the first step. Freedom had been won, but keeping it required vision, courage, and a willingness to face problems head-on even when the path was uncertain. The early presidents, starting with George Washington, had set a precedent that the office of the presidency was about service, restraint, and unity. Washington's farewell address warned citizens against division and foreign entanglements, advice that echoed through the generations. His leadership proved that survival wasn't just about winning wars. It was about building institutions, creating trust, and holding together a diverse population spread across a vast land. The nation was beginning to find its identity, but the work required constant attention, compromise, and moral courage. At the same time, the country was expanding westward, bringing both opportunity and new challenges. Settlers moved into lands previously controlled by Native American nations, creating conflicts that demanded negotiation and diplomacy. New territories tested the authority of the federal government, and citizens grappled with questions of law, order, and fairness. These were not easy choices. Every decision had consequences, and missteps could ignite rebellion or threaten unity. Yet each challenge also pushed the nation forward, teaching Americans how to govern themselves while respecting liberty. Political life continued to be heated, even dangerous at times. The formation of political parties, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, showed that freedom allowed for debate and disagreement, but also carried risks of division. Citizens argued passionately in newspapers, taverns, and public squares. Leaders negotiated, compromised, and sometimes clashed, but the fact that debates could happen without civil war was itself a triumph. The young nation was learning that survival depended not just on armies and treaties, but on ideas, conversation, and the willingness to work together despite differences. Economically, the United States was finding its footing. Trade was expanding, cities were growing, and infrastructure like roads and ports began to connect the distant states. Citizens started seeing the tangible benefits of unity. Markets expanded, wealth increased, and opportunities arose that had been unimaginable during the chaos of the 1780s. Even small victories, like successfully negotiating navigation rights along the Mississippi or establishing a functioning federal bank, were milestones that proved the young nation could not only survive but thrive. And yet, despite these successes, the lessons of the past remained close to the surface. Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and the debates over the Constitution were never far from memory. They were reminders that liberty without structure could lead to chaos, and that survival required constant vigilance. Each generation of Americans would face similar tests in their own ways, requiring the same courage, ingenuity, and commitment that had carried the nation through its earliest years. By the time Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency, the United States was a nation with a clearer sense of itself. Citizens had seen that independence was only meaningful if the nation could govern itself, maintain order, and protect the liberties it had fought for. Leaders had learned that power required responsibility, and that compromise was essential for survival. The young country had endured rebellion, economic hardship, and political division, and had emerged stronger, more cohesive, and more confident in its future. The story of America as survival in its first decades offers a powerful lesson. Freedom is fragile, and victory is never final. Independence is a starting point, not a destination. Every citizen, every leader, and every decision mattered. The United States had faced internal rebellion, international threats, and the chaos of untested governance, and yet, through courage, compromise, and determination, it endured. The nation had learned that survival depended not on luck or luck alone, but on vision, wisdom, and unity. And now, as we look back at those early years, the story becomes more than history, it becomes inspiration. America's founders and early citizens faced impossible odds, yet they persevered. They built a nation that could grow, evolve, and overcome challenges no one could have imagined. The lessons of their struggle remind us that obstacles are not the end, they are the beginning. And just as the United States rose from rebellion and chaos, so too can we face our own challenges with courage and determination. The early history of America is a story of survival, resilience, and hope. It teaches us that the future is built by those willing to fight not just on battlefields, but in ideas, compromises, and everyday choices. And as we continue this journey through history, one truth remains clear: the story of the United States is far from over, and the lessons of its beginnings are more powerful today than ever. So stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, every challenge is an opportunity to learn, grow, and make history just as those early Americans did. Thank you for watching.